Is Russia retreating not because it is losing territory, but because it is losing control of the war itself? In early 2025, a series of abrupt troop movements sent a clear signal that something fundamental had shifted inside Moscow's strategic calculations. Elite formations, long positioned at the most contested stretches of the front, were suddenly pulled back and redirected toward Crimea. This was not announced as a retreat nor framed as an emergency. Official language spoke of redeployment and reinforcement. Yet in military reality, removing top-tier units from active combat zones almost never reflects confidence. It reflects fear that a more critical vulnerability has emerged elsewhere. Crimea has always occupied a unique place in Russia's war planning. It is not just territory. It is symbolism, logistics, prestige, and domestic legitimacy bound together. Losing ground in eastern Ukraine can be explained away with language about tactical depth and patience. Losing Crimea cannot. That distinction explains why Moscow's leadership has increasingly treated the peninsula as a red line that outweighs all others. By early 2025, this priority became unmistakable. Forces normally used for offensive or rapid response operations were reassigned to defensive roles guarding airfields, radar sites, and energy infrastructure, rather than pushing the front forward. This move raised immediate questions among military observers. A commander withdraws elite troops for only two reasons: either victory has been secured, or a more dangerous threat has emerged behind the lines. The first explanation did not fit the battlefield reality, where fighting remained intense and unresolved across multiple axes. The second explanation, however, aligned with a growing pattern of Ukrainian long-range strikes and drone operations that had steadily eroded the perception of Crimea as untouchable. What had once been considered a rear sanctuary was now a contested space under constant pressure. The timing of the redeployments mattered. They did not follow a decisive Ukrainian breakthrough on the ground, but rather an accumulation of strikes targeting air defense nodes, logistics hubs, and energy facilities. These attacks did not aim to seize territory overnight. They aimed to undermine confidence, degrade situational awareness, and force difficult choices. By compelling Russia to concentrate resources in Crimea, Ukraine effectively reshaped Moscow's decision-making environment without launching a major offensive. The withdrawal of elite units carried consequences beyond simple troop numbers. These formations represent institutional memory training capacity and leadership experience. Removing them from frontline sectors weakens not just firepower, but coherence. Replacement units often lack the same integration, reducing the ability to respond to sudden pressure. This trade-off suggested that Moscow viewed the risk to Crimea as more dangerous than the risk of stagnation, or even localized setbacks elsewhere. There was also a psychological dimension. Crimea has been portrayed for years as secure, fortified, and permanently held. Admitting vulnerability there would puncture a core narrative used to sustain domestic support. Redeploying elite troops was a way to shore up that narrative quietly, without acknowledging that the peninsula was now within reach of sustained Ukrainian pressure. Yet the very act of redeployment signaled the opposite, that Crimea could no longer be defended with routine measures alone. This moment marked a shift from strategic ambition to strategic preservation. Rather than shaping the battlefield on its own terms, Moscow began reacting to Ukrainian initiatives. The war entered a phase where preventing symbolic loss took precedence over achieving operational breakthroughs. Such a posture does not mean immediate defeat, but it does indicate narrowing options. Each defensive priority added another constraint, forcing compromises elsewhere along a front that stretches more than 1,000 kilometers. As elite troops dug in around Crimea, the broader question became unavoidable. If Russia must weaken its active fronts to protect what it considers indispensable, how long can that balance hold before defensive necessity turns into strategic exhaustion, and what vulnerabilities might this choice expose next? The identity of the units reassigned to Crimea revealed far more than official statements ever could. These were not reserve battalions or rear area security forces rotated in for routine duty. They were formations designed for high-intensity combat, rapid maneuver, and decisive action. Airborne troops, advanced air defense specialists, and battle-hardened personnel with years of operational experience were shifted away from sectors where pressure remained constant. In military logic, this kind of move carries a clear message: the threat being addressed is considered existential, not incidental. Elite formations exist for a reason. They are expensive to train, difficult to replace, and central to operational flexibility. When deployed on the front, they serve as shock absorbers capable of stabilizing collapsing lines or exploiting fleeting opportunities. Removing them reduces a commander's margin for error. By early 2025, however, Moscow appeared willing to accept that risk. The reason lay in the nature of the challenge Crimea faced. Ukrainian strikes were no longer random or symbolic. They were increasingly synchronized, precise, and designed to test the limits of Russia's defensive architecture. Crimea's existing air defense network had been built around layered systems designed to deter conventional air threats and cruise missiles. What it struggled against was persistence. Small, inexpensive drones arriving in waves created a problem of saturation rather than penetration. Reaction times mattered more than raw firepower. Each successful strike, even when damage was limited, carried strategic weight by demonstrating that defenses could be bypassed. Over time, these demonstrations eroded confidence within the command structure, prompting calls for more experienced operators rather than more equipment. The redeployed units were expected to fill that gap. Their role was not simply to man positions, but to restore credibility. They were tasked with tightening coordination, improving response cycles, and training other units that had failed repeatedly to intercept incoming threats. In effect, they were sent to act as a fire brigade, plugging holes as they appeared. This mission profile, however, underscored the defensive nature of the move. Troops trained for offensive maneuver were now guarding static assets, a reversal that limited their strengths while exposing their vulnerabilities. The cost of this decision became evident almost immediately. Frontline sectors that lost these units did not collapse overnight, but they became more brittle. Replacement forces lacked the same cohesion and adaptability. Small Ukrainian advances or probing attacks encountered less resistance, not because numbers had vanished, but because experience had. The war's tempo shifted subtly, favoring the side that could force reactions rather than initiate them. By reallocating its most capable forces, Moscow ceded initiative in areas where those units had previously anchored the line. There was also an internal signaling effect. Elite troops understand their value and their purpose. Being reassigned from active combat to guard infrastructure sent an implicit message that the center no longer trusted the periphery to hold. For some, it reinforced the sense that strategic priorities were narrowing, focused on symbols rather than outcomes. Morale is shaped not just by conditions, but by perceived intent, and intent increasingly appeared defensive. From a broader perspective, this redeployment highlighted a central dilemma. Protecting high-value assets requires skilled personnel, yet deploying those personnel defensively drains offensive potential elsewhere. This trade-off can be sustained briefly, but over time it compounds. Each additional unit assigned to static defense reduces flexibility across the theater. The more Crimea demanded protection, the less freedom Moscow retained to shape events beyond it. As elite forces settled into defensive roles around the peninsula, attention turned to the consequences beyond Crimea itself. What happens to a long, contested front when its most capable formations are pulled away? And how quickly can an adversary detect and exploit the resulting imbalance? The illusion of Crimea as an impregnable fortress unraveled not through a single dramatic strike, but through a steady campaign that targeted how modern defenses actually function. In 2025, Ukrainian operations increasingly focused on the invisible layer of warfare sensors, command links, and the infrastructure that turns raw data into action. The objective was not merely to destroy hardware, but to interrupt the chain that allows defenders to see, decide, and respond. When that chain breaks, even the most expensive systems lose their meaning. Air defense networks depend on eyes before they depend on missiles. Radar coverage, data fusion, and timely cueing determine whether a threat is intercepted or slips through. Ukrainian planners exploited this dependency by concentrating on systems that form the backbone of situational awareness. Attacks were designed to arrive from unexpected directions at varying altitudes and in combinations that strained coordination. The result was not total blindness, but partial intermittent blindness, arguably more dangerous because it creates false confidence. Defenders see something, but not everything, and cannot be sure which gaps matter most. Energy and logistics facilities were woven into this strategy. Strikes on oil terminals, fuel depots, and power-related infrastructure served a dual purpose. Physically, they disrupted supply and imposed repair costs. Psychologically, they demonstrated reach. When a facility deep behind defensive lines burns, it signals that distance no longer guarantees safety. Each successful hit forced commanders to divert attention and resources, reinforcing a reactive posture. The defense became about plugging leaks rather than controlling space. The timing of these attacks amplified their effect. They coincided with redeployments meant to strengthen Crimea's defenses, undermining the narrative that elite forces could restore control. Even limited damage carried outsized impact when it occurred, despite heightened alert levels. The message was clear: concentration alone could not solve the problem. The challenge was not a lack of personnel, but a mismatch between defensive design and the threat environment. Saturation, persistence, and adaptability favored the attacker. These operations also exposed the limits of static defense in an era of cheap mobile platforms. High-end systems excel at countering predictable threats, but they struggle when faced with numerous low-cost targets that force difficult trade-offs. Every interceptor launched at a drone represents a cost imbalance that favors the attacker over time. This asymmetry does not need to achieve total destruction to be effective. It needs only to impose continuous strain. For Crimea, the implications were profound. The peninsula's value lies in its role as a hub for air operations, naval presence, and logistics. When that hub becomes contested, its utility declines. Aircraft disperse, ships remain in port, and supply flows slow. The fortress becomes a liability, absorbing resources while delivering diminishing returns. Protecting it requires constant vigilance, yet vigilance alone cannot eliminate vulnerability. The broader strategic effect extended beyond Crimea itself. Each successful operation reinforced a pattern: Ukraine could shape Russian behavior without launching large-scale ground offensives. By targeting systems rather than formations, it compelled Moscow to make defensive choices that weakened its overall posture. This approach blurred the line between tactical strikes and strategic outcomes, demonstrating how precision and persistence can substitute for mass. As defenses struggled to adapt, the question shifted from whether Crimea could be protected to at what cost. How many resources must be tied down to defend every critical node, and what opportunities does that create elsewhere when an entire theater becomes focused on protecting its eyes rather than projecting power? As elite formations were redirected toward Crimea, the effects along the active front lines became increasingly difficult to disguise. The removal of high-capability units did not immediately trigger dramatic collapses, but it altered the texture of the battlefield in ways that favored the side able to probe, test, and adapt. Fronts that had once been anchored by experienced formations now relied on units with thinner leadership, weaker coordination, and limited reserves. This change did not announce itself loudly, but it reshaped day-to-day combat dynamics. In contested sectors of eastern and southern Ukraine, the absence of elite troops reduced flexibility. Positions could still be held, but responses became slower and more predictable. Small Ukrainian advances, reconnaissance in force operations, and precision strikes met less adaptive resistance. Where elite units once absorbed pressure and stabilized weak points, replacement forces tended to hold rigidly or withdraw abruptly. This rigidity created exploitable patterns. Defense shifted from maneuver to endurance, a posture that works only as long as supply morale and command coherence remain intact. The gaps were not purely physical, they were organizational. Elite units often serve as informal coordinators between neighboring formations, smoothing friction and sharing situational awareness. Their departure fractured these networks. Communication became more siloed, and local commanders had fewer tools to respond to sudden developments. In such conditions, even limited Ukrainian successes carried amplified impact, forcing broader adjustments along the line. Each adjustment consumed time and attention, reinforcing the reactive cycle already imposed by pressure on Crimea. Logistics felt the strain as well. Routes that once supported high-tempo operations now served units focused on holding ground. Ammunition distribution became less responsive and maintenance backlogs grew. Vehicles remained serviceable on paper but unavailable in practice. This logistical drag further reduced operational options, making counterattacks increasingly rare. The front did not collapse, but it hardened into a brittle structure vulnerable to cumulative stress rather than decisive blows. Morale followed a similar trajectory. Soldiers remaining at the front were acutely aware that elite reinforcements were no longer coming. The perception that priority had shifted elsewhere weighed heavily. Even when conditions were unchanged materially, belief in strategic purpose eroded. Units fight differently when they feel central to the mission versus when they feel expendable. Over time, this psychological shift influences everything from risk tolerance to cohesion. From Ukraine's perspective, these developments validated a strategy of indirect pressure. By forcing Russia to defend everywhere at once, Ukrainian planners could dictate tempo without mass assaults. Each gap created by redeployment became a potential lever. Intelligence monitoring focused on detecting thinning sectors not for immediate breakthroughs, but for shaping future options. The goal was to stretch the opponent's attention until choices became mutually exclusive. The longer this imbalance persisted, the more it compounded. Reinforcing one sector meant weakening another. Attempts to rotate units exposed vulnerabilities during transition periods. Over time, the front evolved into a patchwork of priorities rather than a unified defensive system. This fragmentation favored a force that could concentrate effort selectively, even with fewer resources. As these gaps widened subtly but steadily, the strategic question sharpened. If protecting Crimea requires sustained diversion of elite forces, can the remaining frontline structure endure prolonged pressure without losing coherence? And how might these hidden weaknesses shape the next phase of the conflict? While battlefield adjustments drew immediate attention, the more damaging effects of the Crimean pressure campaign unfolded in the economic and logistical domain. By 2025, the conflict had expanded decisively into a contest over infrastructure revenue streams and industrial endurance. Strikes on energy terminals, fuel depots, and transport hubs were no longer isolated acts of disruption. They formed a coherent pattern aimed at constricting the financial and logistical arteries that sustained Russia's war effort, especially those linked to the Black Sea corridor. Energy infrastructure occupied a central place in this strategy because it sits at the intersection of military logistics and national revenue. Facilities supporting oil storage, processing, and export do more than power vehicles and aircraft. They generate the foreign currency required to procure equipment, compensate soldiers, and stabilize the domestic economy. When these nodes were hit, the damage extended beyond physical destruction. Insurance premiums rose, shipping schedules became uncertain, and buyers demanded deeper discounts to offset risk. Each disruption translated into reduced income per barrel, a quiet but persistent erosion of financial capacity. The geographic concentration of these attacks mattered. The Black Sea region functions as a vital outlet for energy exports that bypass longer, more vulnerable land routes. When terminals and ports in this area came under repeated pressure, the impact rippled outward. Logistics chains lengthened, costs increased, and redundancy options narrowed. What appeared as a localized strike often produced system-wide consequences, forcing planners to reroute flows and accept inefficiencies that accumulated over time. Domestic effects soon followed. Fuel shortages in agricultural and industrial regions highlighted a paradox: a major energy producer struggling to supply its own economy. Farmers faced delays during critical seasons, transport costs rose, and regional authorities scrambled to manage shortages. These disruptions undermined narratives of stability and control, bringing the war's consequences into everyday life. When civilians encounter the conflict at gas pumps and supply depots, distance collapses and political insulation weakens. From a military standpoint, the economic strain fed back into operational constraints. Reduced revenue limited the pace at which losses could be replaced or repaired. Maintenance cycles stretched, spare parts became scarcer, and modernization efforts slowed. Over time, this financial drag compounded the manpower and logistics issues already visible at the front. The war became not just a test of will, but a test of balance sheets. The international dimension further complicated matters. Buyers and partners adjusted behavior in response to perceived instability, not out of ideology, but risk management. As reliability declined, leverage shifted. Transactions increasingly favored those willing to dictate terms, deepening dependency and reducing strategic autonomy. Each compromised shipment or delayed delivery reinforced the perception that key corridors were vulnerable and contested. This form of pressure differed fundamentally from traditional sanctions or blockades. It operated dynamically, responding to adaptations and exploiting weak points as they emerged. The objective was not immediate collapse, but cumulative disadvantage. Over months, the cost of maintaining the war rose while returns diminished. This asymmetry favored the side able to impose uncertainty at relatively low cost, forcing the opponent to defend expensive assets continuously. By late 2025, the economic front had become inseparable from the military one. Protecting infrastructure demanded resources that could not be used elsewhere, while each successful strike magnified financial and psychological strain. The conflict thus evolved into a contest over sustainability rather than speed. If energy choke points remain under pressure and revenue continues to erode, how long can a war effort reliant on constant expenditure endure before economic gravity reshapes strategic choices? By late 2025, the fixation on Crimea had evolved from a defensive necessity into a strategic constraint with implications far beyond the peninsula itself. What began as a localized effort to protect high-value assets gradually reshaped Russia's entire war posture, narrowing options and forcing trade-offs that favored its adversaries. From a Western and NATO perspective, this shift offered a revealing case study in how modern conflicts punish rigidity and reward adaptive pressure. At the strategic level, Russia's choices signaled a transition from initiative to containment. By concentrating elite forces and air defense resources around Crimea, Moscow effectively acknowledged that it could no longer defend all priorities simultaneously. This concentration reduced flexibility across the wider theater, limiting the ability to respond to sudden developments or exploit opportunities. For NATO planners, the lesson was clear: even a numerically large military can be constrained when forced to defend symbolic and logistical nodes under persistent threat. The situation also highlighted the growing importance of integrated multi-domain operations. Ukrainian pressure combined air, sea, cyber, and economic effects into a single continuum. Rather than seeking decisive battles, it targeted the systems that enable endurance. This approach resonated strongly with Western strategic thinking, which increasingly emphasizes resilience, network protection, and the ability to absorb shocks. Crimea became an example of how static defense against dynamic threats creates diminishing returns. For the United States and its allies, the conflict reinforced the value of long-range precision intelligence integration and cost imposition strategies. Low-cost systems used persistently forced disproportionate defensive spending and redeployment. The asymmetry mattered. It demonstrated that maintaining superiority does not always require matching capability for capability, but rather exploiting the opponent's need to protect high-value assets continuously. There were also broader geopolitical implications. As Russia devoted more resources to internal defense, its capacity to project power elsewhere diminished. Commitments became harder to sustain, and alliances grew more transactional. Observers noted that prolonged fixation on Crimea risked turning a strategic asset into a strategic sinkhole, consuming attention without delivering proportional advantage. For Western policymakers, this underscored how regional conflicts can reshape global balances by draining focus and resources. The conflict's trajectory suggested that future wars may be decided less by territorial conquest than by systemic exhaustion. States that fail to align military objectives with economic and societal resilience face long-term erosion even if front lines remain relatively static. NATO's emphasis on sustainability, interoperability, and shared burden appeared increasingly relevant in contrast. As 2025 drew on, the central question was no longer whether Crimea could be held indefinitely, but at what cost to the rest of the war effort. Each additional layer of defense reduced freedom of action elsewhere. Each redeployment narrowed strategic depth. For observers and policymakers alike, the situation posed a final unsettling question: when defending a symbol consumes the strength needed to pursue victory, does holding that symbol ultimately weaken the very power it was meant to protect?